The war in Ukraine certainly is not over by any means. In fact, the two sides, the U.S.-led coalition and Russia, have not sat down to negotiate. That destabilizes the whole world. Similarly, the U.S. and China tensions, of course, are high and still rising. So I think we're living in a period when geopolitics really dominates the global economy. And as long as geopolitics is as fraught with division as it is right now, it's hard to believe that we're going to have any kind of smooth sailing economically.
And speaking of which, let's move a little onto your forecasts for the trajectory of world politics. Now, as we approach 1 year since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, can we see an end to the conflict in the near future, or is it likely to escalate, in your view? What are the current options that are still available to resolve it?
Well, negotiations could end this because the terms on which the war could end are pretty clear. Ukraine would be neutral. NATO would acknowledge it's not enlarging, which is one of the main causes of this war. Crimea would remain in Russia's hands, and Russia would withdraw from Ukraine because there would be a kind of political settlement or armistice. The fact of the matter is, however, neither the U.S.-led coalition nor Russia right now are talking with each other. The U.S. basically ruled out negotiations a year ago. Big mistake in my view, but it ruled out negotiations. It said Ukraine will win on the battlefield. I think that's unlikely, very frankly. But it means that the two sides are not talking right now. If they did, the whole world would breathe a sigh of relief, but they're not talking right now.
What can be done to resolve it then? What options are still available? Are there key players, countries, organizations that can move this along to resolution?
I think that the countries that are not party to the conflict, big powers like India, which is the presidency of the G20 this year, like Brazil, the major power of Latin America, where President Lula has said to both sides, this war has to stop. This is where I think action could happen. If it's just NATO versus Russia, they're going to continue to escalate, causing extraordinary harm in Ukraine and damage to the whole world, a great threat to the whole world. But if major powers on the outside, India, Indonesia, Brazil, China, others that have relations with both sides, with Russia and with the West, say, stop the war, because this is hurting everybody, first and foremost Ukraine. This could make a big difference. So I'm looking for the voices of those countries not directly engaged. We've heard from the US, we've heard from the UK, we've heard from the EU, we've heard from Russia, we've heard from Ukraine, but the vast majority of the world has been on the sidelines. And I think that if those countries come forward right now, especially India as president of the G20, Brazil, Indonesia, other major countries, and say, this war is devastating for all sides, stop, it would make a big difference. That's my own view.
And moving away from the small players to the big ones, with US-China tensions escalating, are we likely to see the spread of war and proxy conflicts? Can we see that intensifying? Are the US and China on the path to eventually coming to blows in Asia, for example, in Taiwan, in the South China Sea?
It's very dangerous right now, and we should understand that Ukraine was dangerous for many years before full-scale war broke out. We should look at Ukraine as a warning sign, a bright red warning sign. I personally feel the United States has pushed very hard on China, for example, on these unilateral trade measures and sanctions measures and technology measures and forming new military alliances in Asia. None of it has been constructive, and I think that we need constructive approaches right now to stop the two giants from continuing on this very dangerous collision course. Take Ukraine as a warning sign. The same could happen in Asia. It would be devastating for the world. We need China and the United States to be talking with each other, to be negotiating with each other, to be in dialogue with each other. It's not happening right now.
And what role then does Southeast Asia play in that dialogue? In global geopolitics, how can countries here navigate those relations with the two big powers, US and China?
This is a very good question, because the US approach always is either you're with us or against us. So it talks to every member of ASEAN and says, you're on our side. And of course, every country in ASEAN has and needs relations, very strong relations, economically, financially, technologically, ecologically with China, as well as wanting relations with the United States. And nobody should be forced to choose sides. So I hope that ASEAN as a group could say to the United States and say to China, don't make us choose. If we have to choose, we choose. We want decent relations with both sides. We don't want to choose. It's very dangerous. And this is why geopolitical conflicts among major powers, whether it's the US and Russia or the US and China, is extremely dangerous for everybody else. But why the rest of the world has to say very clearly, we don't want to be pulled into your brawls. Better yet, stop the brawling, because two main powers should be able to cooperate with each other and avoid conflict.
And Professor, I want to move now into Asia's role as well in that transition to sustainable development. That's vital not only for Asia's future, but also for the rest of the world. In your view, what are some of the major challenges when it comes to making this shift in sustainability in this region, and how can the governments here overcome them?
Well, of course, I think it always goes without saying, but probably always needs to be said. Asia's home to around 60% of the world population, and more than half of the world output, and more than half of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, and more than half of the world's environmental crises. So the future of the world, of course, is the future of Asia, and what Asia does is going to shape the entire 21st century fundamentally. And Asia needs to do two basic things. First, to cooperate within Asia rather than having these tensions, because everything that needs to be done, whether it is decarbonizing the energy system, protecting the rainforests of Southeast Asia, protecting the food supplies for more than half the world's population, is a cooperative venture. This is the first point. The second point is Asia needs to create the financing institutions and the practical plans to actually get done what needs to be done, which is transform our energy systems from fossil fuel based, and Asia is a completely fossil fuel based part of the world economy, to green energy, and not in the long term. We have a very few years to get this done. Fortunately, the Asian economies have tremendous capacity when they put their minds to it, when they cooperate with each other. Who had the fastest economic transformation in world history? China. China can do a great deal cooperatively. Which country is the fastest growing large economy in the world? It's India. So if India and China cooperate, if ASEAN is part of that cooperation, if groups like RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which means ASEAN plus China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand work together, these problems can be solved. But to do all of this, we have to put aside the old 20th century outmoded geopolitics. That is the US versus Russia. What could be more 20th century than that? Or the US versus China. We have to think in a 21st century way, and especially Asia has to stand together.